All right, what's up, everybody? If you don't know who I am, my name's James. I'm a YouTuber, guitar player, Axe Effects owner. Um, and this is the first time I've kind of done something like this, but the goal of this video is for me to give you an in-depth tutorial and demo of the Matchless Chieftain amp sim on the Axe Effects. I have the three, but I've had all three Axe Effects models at one time or another. So even though I'm on the three, this would apply to really anybody who's using any iteration of the Axe Effects, or actually anybody who owns the amp, I think would find this useful as well. But before I do that, I want to kind of quickly talk about why I'm doing this and what I'm hoping to achieve. If you're really just interested in the tutorial, I'll put a timestamp in the description so you can go ahead and see where that is and start that. But other than that, like I said, my name is James. I've been using the Axe Effects for almost 10 years now. And the reason I decided to try this is I have always been kind of wowed and infatuated by the detail and the accuracy of the amps in the Axe Effects. I love the Yex guide, which I'll kind of pull up here really quickly, that goes into all this detail on the Axe Effects. And the only thing I've always wanted is maybe a YouTube series that covers a lot of this stuff in really deep detail. There's some stuff that's not in the guide, or for certain amps I've discovered, or maybe people don't know to put it. Obviously, I think the best source of information about the amps and the Axe Effects is the Yex guide. So kudos to that guy for doing that. And honestly, I feel like if I do more of these tutorials, I'll be referencing the guide a lot. So I need to give him some credit right off the bat. But there's also a lot of other things that I'm going to go into that might not necessarily be in the guide. The other thing I want to say is when I first had this idea recently, I realized that there's another YouTuber named Leon Todd who does some amazing tutorials and is probably a way better player than me and a super knowledgeable guy. He has kind of done an iteration of this idea already, where he'll go into certain amp types and kind of give some tips and tricks about how to make certain sounds happen and how to tweak the amps. I am not trying to copy that or do the same thing. I'm trying to really go into the weeds here and give you some information about the amp and the history of the amp, how the amp's supposed to sound, what famous artists have used the amp and maybe how they use it, and really just anything about the amp that you might want to know if you're going to use it a lot in the Axe Effects. Stuff I would want to know. Really, this video is more for myself than anybody, and I floated the idea on the forum, and it was kind of received pretty well as something that people would want. So we're going to do it. We're going to try it, and you may think it's terrible, and I welcome your negative or positive feedback. That's totally fine. But yeah, that's my goal here. I'm trying to give you as much info on the amp as possible. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up a picture of the amp here. This is the Matchless Chieftain, and just some quick information about the amp before I go into the history of the amp. It's on paper a 40-watt amp, EL34. In truth, I think it's probably closer to 50 watts from everything I've read. It's definitely got that two EL34s, getting about 25 watts out of each, or so. So it's probably more of a 50-watt amp. Controls. You've got your volume, bass, mid, treble, brilliance, which we'll talk about in a second, master control, and then, of course, a reverb control. And that is reflected pretty accurately here on the authentic panel of the Axe Effects 3. The only thing I would mention, and I'll go into this maybe later, is that the brilliance control on this amp is a little misleading. It's not a presence control like the brilliance label might make you believe. It is indeed a high cut, and it's a Vox amp style high cut. So that's why on the unit itself, you see the high cut knob here labeled as such. It's going to cut highs as you turn it up. So don't be fooled by the brilliance control over here. It's a high cut. But before I get too deep into the controls of the amp and the layout, I wanted to kind of give you the history of the amp. So if you know your Matchless history, company was founded by a guy named Mark Sampson in the very early 90s. And Mark was sort of obsessed with Vox and Marshall and any British amps he could get his hands on, specifically Vox stuff. He kind of made his living fixing Vox amps for high-profile musicians. I know there's a story he told about he got called to a LA studio at 3 a.m. in the morning because the Edge couldn't get his Vox to sound right, and he had to dial it in for him or fix it or whatever. And it's all kind of mythical stuff, and he's sort of a revered figure in the amp world, Mark Sampson, that is. He basically started Matchless because people were asking for a Vox AC30 that wouldn't break on the road. So he didn't really redesign the amp. He basically built an AC30 that was reliable, sounded better, had better parts. And that amp, of course, became the DC30, which is by far the most popular, most well-known Matchless amp. It is also in the XFX, and you may find this interesting if you like to use that amp sim as well. I chose the Chieftain because it's one of my favorite amps, and I feel like I know a lot about it, so that was a good amp to start with here. But that amp became very famous when Guitar Player did a combo, a 212 combo shootout in 1992, I believe, and asked Mark if he would send them one of the DC30s he was making, and he was just scraping by at the time, but he managed to kind of squeeze out a DC30 before the deadline, and infamously the DC30 won the amp shootout in Guitar Player magazine, became very popular very quickly. I believe Jackson Browne was an early adopter of the amp, and we'll talk about guys who use the amp in a second, but it kind of skyrocketed Matchless into some early fame. The first prototype for the Matchless Chieftain was made in 1994, and ironically, that amp is on Reverb right now. It was listed a couple months ago. You know, if you want it, you can go ahead and chunk down $5,000 plus $250 shipping. By the way, that's kind of unimportant, but I thought that was kind of cool that the actual prototype is up right now. So the prototype for the Chieftain was made a couple years after the DC30. And there's really not a lot of information around about the creation of the Chieftain, but from everything I can gather, it was built to be a very loud amp for stage use, not necessarily an amp you would want to use at home or even in the studio. It was built for these big rock bands, I think, that were asking for maybe something a little bit louder at the time, and the tone of the amp has been described as many things. I've heard it described as cranked Fender. I've heard it's Matchless's take on Marshall. I've heard that it's Vox meets Marshall. I would say that the truth is somewhere in between all of those things. When I hear the amp, I think at low volume, it has a little bit more of the Vox thing going on. At high volume, it's definitely, or at high gain settings, with the volume turned up here, it turns into more of a Marshall. And then depending on where you put the mid control, it becomes more of a Marshall, a Vox, or a Fender. It's a hard to define sound. The only thing I will say about the amp is it doesn't lend itself well to playing around in your house for a couple reasons. Obviously, if we're talking about the real amp, it's extremely loud. And even though it has a master control to kind of tone down the volume on it, I've frequently heard, and I've actually owned a couple of real Chieftains and can confirm this, it doesn't sound good as a bedroom amp. It's meant to be cranked up to ear-shattering volumes, and if you don't do that, it's just not going to sound good. The other reason I think it's really more of a live amp, or at least an amp to be used in a band situation, it really has a lot of upper mid high end content. It's a very biting amp. It's a treble amp. It cuts through in a really apparent way. So it's really not an amp you would just mess around with on your own, or even maybe in the studio, unless you were trying to cut through a super dense mix. So just kind of keep that in mind. I think it's one of the best live amps ever for that reason, though. A few things I want to point out about the amp that may confuse some people. And I labeled this as quirks, right? So the first thing that's a little odd is the bass and the mid control that are pre-gain. The tone stack is pre-gain, but the treble is post-gain. And I put supposedly there because if you actually go into the preamp section in the Axe Effects, it says that the tone stack location is pre. Well, that should be true for the bass and mids, although in the actual amp, the treble is post. Another strange thing in this amp is that the EQ controls, and specifically the bass, they don't just change their respective frequencies. They change other frequencies. So if you turn down the bass, it actually also turns up some treble frequencies, which is a little strange, and it's called an interactive tone stack, which is not necessarily a normal thing for this kind of amp. I talked about the brilliant control and how it's actually a high cut. And the other thing I'll say about the bass control is it is extremely sensitive. I find that I never run the bass higher than maybe noon or 1 o'clock on this amp, because it can get very flubby very quickly, especially as you turn the drive up. So depending on where you have the volume set, I think the bass sounds great either at noon or as low as 0, honestly, as you'll kind of hear. It really depends on the guitar and where you have the volume set, though. The mid knob, and I alluded to this already, I really see the mid knob as more of a character knob. And what I mean by that is when you have the mid knob set high, the amp really gets into more of a Marshall sound. And as you turn it down, it goes into more of a traditional Vox sound, and it almost even into more of a Fender sound as you turn it all the way down. So that's kind of something to note. And the final thing that I would mention, and this is a mystery to me, is the weird inclusion of the Boutique 2 amp model. I'm on Boutique 1 right now, and I know most people tend to stay on Boutique 1. But if you go to the Yex guide, and it says this in Cliff's notes as well, Boutique 2, here we are. It says right here, Boutique 2 is a model with a boost for more gain and high frequency emphasis. Okay. If you know the Matchless Chieftain, you know that there's no boost on the amp. There's no channel 2. There's nothing. And when I read this, I was very confused about why there would be a Boutique 2 if there's no reason to have one on the amp. I was really confused about that. And I searched high and low on the Fractal Audio forums and found nothing. And then I started to research the amp itself. And what better way to research this amp than Instagram? Something I discovered was that there's a couple of different versions of the Chieftain. There, as you see here, is a single input version, which seems to be maybe slightly more or less common depending on what you Google. You see here this red maroon one on the right here is a single input. You see below it you have the salt and pepper one that's single input. You have the green and black one single input. But if you scroll up here, I'm going to show you a few now. You have this, and this. All three of these on the top. They're high-low input. And I researched this for a while. It seems like sometime in the early 2000s, after the company was acquired by Phil Jameson, they started including high-low inputs, and I think they still do to this day. My best guess is that the Chieftain that Cliff has modeled in the Axe-Fx is a post-2001 Matchless Chieftain, and perhaps the Boutique 2 is supposed to be the high input, and the Boutique 1 is the low input on the amp. Now, I know what you're thinking. That can't be right, because by default, if an amp has a high and a low input in the Axe-Fx, the high is modeled with input trim at 1.0, while the low would be modeled at about 0.500. That's how it's been for a while now. But I would argue that when Cliff modeled Boutique 1 and 2, the input trim was not in existence, and that whole high-low input trim adjustment nomenclature was not yet involved in the Axe-Fx. So my argument there is that Boutique 1 and 2 are just respectively modeled high and low inputs on the Chieftain. I cannot confirm if this is true or not. It's just my theory. And as far as I can tell, it's never been answered or addressed by Cliff. I would love it if someone could reply to this who actually knows. That'd be very helpful for me and a lot of people. But that's my best guess, and my ears tell me that that's probably pretty accurate as well. One more thing I want to say about the controls of the amp. The master volume. Everything I've read about the Chieftain has informed me that this amp is really meant to be ran with the master maxed. The master really just exists for people who are trying to run the amp at lower volume. So in the Axe-Fx, that's a moot point. You can adjust the volume irregardless of where the amp is set inside the Axe-Fx. So in my mind, you would want to run the master full up at all time and use the volume exclusively for your gain, or how much gain you want. That's how the amp was designed to work. So that makes sense. Obviously, the reverb control is not modeled here. But that's just a note about the master. Weirdly, when you load up the amp in the Axe-Fx, the master by default goes to 5. I'm not really sure why. To me, it's best ran at full up, at 10. Talking about cabs, and this is very important. If you know the the Matchless company, you know that the 2x12 cabs they're famous for using actually have modified versions of a G12H30 and a G12 M25 greenback. They are modified at Celestion for Matchless and have been since 1992. A lot of people know that, but the reason for that is lesser known. Mark Sampson originally wanted to use Alnico Blues, which were obviously very famous for being used with box amps. And unfortunately, at the time, he could not get a hold of a production line, Alnico Blue, from Celestion. So Celestion's answer to that was, well, just use other speakers we make, or we'll make you a custom speaker, but we can't get Alnico. So Sampson went with the G12H30 and the G12 M25 combination and actually further modified the amps to sound good with those speakers, which to me that says he originally wanted the Alnico Blues, but it doesn't make sense to use Alnico Blues with this amp necessarily because the amps historically were tweaked to work with the Matchless speakers specifically. So in that case, I would probably use the Boutique amp IRs. Unfortunately, if you type in Boutique, which is the Matchless amps that are in the Axe-Fx, there's only 3 matchless IRs in the Axe-Fx. You got the Red Wires Boutique from way back when. You've got an R121 IR that I think sounds amazing, and then you got the Boutique Mix, obviously. To my ears, the 121 is just magic. I've tried a lot of IRs with this amp, and for whatever reason, that 121 really smooths out the kind of aggressive high-end crang that this amp makes, the sound it makes. If you are interested in getting a hold of a lot of boutique or matchless 212 IRs, the Austin Buddy Fantastic 2x12s cab pack, which is a little old at this point, but I think it's still good. It is an ultra res cab pack. It actually includes two matchless 212s with the custom speakers in them, so that's pretty cool. I may actually own this cab pack, but I'm not sure if I've loaded it in to my Axe-Fx. So that's pretty neat. That's just an aside. If you want to, get a hold of some more IRs, I can't speak from memory about how good they are. I'm guessing that these IRs may actually be from that pack, or at least the R121 could be. Anyway, let's talk about who uses this amp really quickly. Probably the most famous user is Derek Trucks, who famously used the 2x10, the very desirable 2x10 combo, which was stolen in 2006. I think he has either gotten a new one or found the stolen one because he still uses it. He's probably the most famous user of it. Another very popular guy who's been known to use the Chieftain for many years now is James Duke, who's kind of a praise and worship player. He actually has a video on YouTube where he talks about this amp for a pretty good while. You can see his pedal board here that he uses with the amp, and then he talks about, you can see his control scheme here, which is really quite similar to how I have it set up and right now. He uses a Morning Glory from JHS and a JHS Bonsai on the 2 Screamer 9 setting. And we actually have a TS9 in the Axe-Fx, so you could use that if you're trying to do what he does with it. Andy Othling, who is a pretty popular ambient guitar player, used to use a Chieftain for quite some time. Now uses a Clubman, which is a very similar amp to the Chieftain. Grant Mickelson uses one live. He's a very popular Nashville musician. He was Taylor Swift's guitarist for several years. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I brought Taylor Swift into this, but he's a pretty well-regarded guy. Sonny Landreth uses the amp as well, but interestingly, he uses it with a Fender 212, so maybe you could try that if you're trying to get some of those tones. Colin James, very famous blues guitar player, more recently, he uses a Chieftain, which is kind of an uncommon use of the Chieftain. I think the Chieftain shines really when you're playing rhythm guitar, but he uses it more for lead stuff, and it's definitely cuts through. And also worth mentioning, the Black Crows use the Matchless Super Chief, which is just a 120 watt version of this amp. Supposedly is a little more on the Marshall Plexi side of things, while this amp I think is a little bit less Marshall and a little bit more maybe Vox Fender. So that's a pretty cool tidbit there. It's not an extremely widely used amp. As you can see, this is a pretty short list of guys. I'm sure there's a couple I missed. Obviously, Jackson Brown used to use one, was one of the first users of the Chieftain, but it's not a star-studded lineup. It's just a handful of well-known guys. Anyway, I think that pretty much sums up everything I have to say about the Chieftain. I've talked about all the different quirks of the amp and all that stuff, so I think it's time to kind of show you how it sounds and how you can use it. So let's move on to the demo portion of the tutorial. All right, hey guys, we're back. I am gonna play through an American Standard Telecaster that's loaded with some Cavalier pickups. I think I've got a Nashville Cavalier Nashville in the bridge, so it's kind of that slightly overwound telly thing going on. Pretty standard. I think this amp sounds best through a Telecaster or a Les Paul or a Gretsch. I don't necessarily think it's the best amp for a Strat because Strats can be pretty punchy in the high end, and this amp has got tons of that going on. So your mileage may vary. Obviously, there's no wrong way to do it, but that's kind of what I hear. So I've got a few scenes set up with some sounds here, and I'm going to start off with a very clean, kind of standard setup for this amp. Everything's close to noon on the EQs. I've got the volume set up for just some edge breakup here. And I'm actually going to start off finger picking, and then I'm going to sort of dig into it a little bit so you can get a good idea of the crazy dynamic range that this amp has. All right, so pretty standard stuff, right? We're going just through the 121 cab, a little bit of studio reverb going on just to kind of fill out the sound. And you already hear there where it can go from like a pristine, warm-ish, clean sound to kind of that jangly, slight edge breakup tone. And if you're going to use pedals, this is probably where I would have this amp all the time. And people ask, who is this amp for? Who should be using the Chieftain? Well, if you're like me and you play live gigs with the Axe-Fx, you probably have noticed that if you swap amp models a lot, it can kind of lead to some inconsistencies in your sound, right? If you have a Fender sound and then you switch to a Marshall sound during a gig, some guys can pull it off, but for me, it's sort of like oh my gosh, like my sound just totally changed, and it can lead to some head scratches in the audience. I think the Chieftain is best used for guys who want to take their Fractal out to a gig and just stick to one amp and sort of use scenes and pedals to change their amp tone. Because as you can see, this amp can go from clean to gain just by dialing the knobs, and it does everything really well. So I'm going to switch over to scene 2 now. And we've got a little bit more gain going on here. We barely had to tweak the EQ, maybe bring the bass down a little bit to compensate. But I'm going to show you how this amp kind of can really be dynamic. So I'm just going to, again, start with finger picking here, and then I'm going to go heavier with the pick. So yeah, you can hear there, it really can go from just kind of clean dynamics to almost a crunch sound. No volume knob needed. Just use your picking hand. Um, I will tell you that the drive models can have some mixed results with this amp. I don't know if it's necessarily the best amp to feed overdrives into. What I like to do is create 4 channels on this amp and just have them go, I'll walk you through this real quick. A, B, C, a little bit more, and then D, I've actually got Boutique 2 pulled up. But going back to B, if you really want to use an overdrive, I think the treble boost is the way to go here. And I'll just kind of show you. So this is my rhythm tone right now. Yeah, it really kind of hits the amp in a pleasant way. It's not too harsh, it's not too muddy. You turn the tone control down on the treble boost, it cleans up all that mud that kind of happens when you turn an amp like this up on the volume. I'm gonna now show you where I think this amp really shines and is really underrated. If you pull the gain up to about 2 o'clock, and obviously you've got to pull the bass way down because this amp can get flubby really fast. You're going to hear this amp really cook here. Yeah, it sounds really good. I would say it's kind of like a Plexi meets something. It's hard to describe. It's really cool for getting. This amp can do the Vox clean thing, right? It can do the praise and worship thing, but it can also, at middle gain, can do that sort of Maroon 5 spanky Telecaster sound. And then if you really crank it up, I kind of hear those alt rock, maybe Third Eye Blind rhythm sounds start to pop out. And really quickly going back to 2 here. Yeah, really quickly going back to preset 2 here. I want to show you how Boutique 1 can sound. So if you turn the mid knob down, you're going to have some stuff like this happen. But if you turn it up, yeah, if you turn the mid down, it becomes a little more voxy, a little more fendery, and then if you turn the mids up, it can kind of turn into more of a a hot Marshall with like an aggressive, more gainy mid-focus sound. It's very subtle. I will say that. It's not a strong change. All right, so the last thing I want to show you, moving over to Boutique 2 here, is really something that's hard to do in a demo because Boutique 2 is really just more gain and more high end. So I'll show you Boutique 2 real quick. If we switch back to like Boutique 1, so basically the same settings there, but what I hear is a lot more low end and a lot less gain, right? So the way I would approach this is, if you've got a guitar that puts out a little more low end, use Boutique 2, right? That's an easy way to put it. If you want a higher gain sound, use Boutique 2. You can really get cranked with 2. I think the reason 2 has less low end in it is since it's a higher gain version of 1, you don't want as much low end in your tone. It's going to get muddy. So that makes sense to me. That's really all the different ways you can use this amp, right? It can be a straight up rock machine. It can do the clean thing and everywhere in between. Great live amp in a thick band mix. It's always going to cut through. And yeah, that's how I would use it. So if you have any questions, hit me up. If you have constructive criticism, I know this was a long video, but again, I'm trying to give you as much information as possible in as short amount of time as I can. So yeah, let me know comments-wise what you guys think, improvements and whatnot. But I really appreciate it. I hope you found this helpful. Have a good day.